I never liked the idea of visiting my grandma's ex-husband's cabin. But there are things in life we don't get a say in. It wasn't my choice. It was my responsibility. When my grandma called me up and asked if I could check on the place, I knew I couldn't say no. She was getting older, and no one else was willing to make the trip. The place had been sitting empty for over a decade, but legally, it was still in her name. She wanted to sell it, and to do that, someone needed to go up there, make sure it was still standing, and see what needed fixing. I should have said no. The drive up was long, the kind that makes you feel like you're heading to the edge of the world. The cabin was deep in the woods, way up in the mountains where phone signals didn't reach. My grandma had only ever talked about it once, telling me she never wanted to step foot in it again after she and her ex divorced. Something about that place unsettled her, and I figured it was just the bad memories. She never gave me a real reason, just that it was his place, not hers, and she wanted nothing to do with it. I didn't ask questions. I didn't think it mattered. By the time I reached the base of the mountain road, the weather had turned. It wasn't raining, but it felt like it wanted to. The air was thick, the sky a dull shade of gray, and everything felt muted. Even my truck's engine sounded quieter than usual. The dirt road leading up was in rough shape, worse than I expected. I had to take it slow, weaving around potholes and fallen branches. The trees pressed in close on either side, thick and dark, blocking out most of the light. It made me uneasy, like I was heading somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The place was still standing, but just barely. The roof sagged in places, the wooden steps creaked under my weight, and the door's paint had long since peeled away. The windows were intact, but so covered in grime that I couldn't see inside. The first thing that struck me was how still everything was. The forest behind me was silent. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just quiet. I unlocked the door, pushing it open with more force than I expected. The hinges groaned, and a stale, musty smell hit me. The inside looked almost exactly as I imagined. Dust-covered furniture, cobwebs in every corner, and the kind of darkness that sinks into the walls over time. It felt like stepping into a place that had been forgotten. I moved through each room, checking the structure. The living room was cluttered with old furniture. The kitchen smelled of rotting wood, and the bedroom still had an unmade bed like someone had left in a hurry. I felt uncomfortable, like I was intruding on something, but I ignored it. The sooner I finished, the sooner I could leave. Then I found the basement door. I didn't want to open it. Something about it felt wrong. Unlike the rest of the cabin, the door looked new. The handle was shiny, the wood had no dust, and there was a heavy-duty lock hanging from it. A lock that hadn't rusted. I should have left, but I didn't. I found the key in the kitchen drawer, slid it into the lock, and twisted. The click echoed through the cabin, loud in the silence. I hesitated, but I pushed the door open anyway. The smell hit me first, something damp and rotten. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The basement was unfinished, just dirt walls and a low ceiling. At first, it looked empty. Then I saw the footprints, fresh ones, deep impressions in the dirt, leading from the bottom of the stairs to the far wall. My stomach tightened. No one had been here in years. No one except me, but the footprints were new. I followed them. They led to an old wooden wardrobe shoved against the wall. It was out of place, too new to belong in a cabin this old. My breath felt too loud in my own ears as I reached out and pulled it open. Inside, there was a tunnel, a narrow passage carved into the earth, leading somewhere. The air that came from it was ice-cold, damp, and wrong. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I had to know. I squeezed inside, flashlight shaking in my grip, and followed the tunnel. The dirt walls were damp, roots sticking out in places. It twisted and turned, going deeper than I expected. The air got worse, heavy, thick, suffocating. I don't know how long I walked before I reached the end. And then I saw it. A small room barely big enough to stand in. A single wooden chair sat in the center, and on it rope, old, frayed, and stained. The dirt floor around the chair was disturbed, like someone had struggled there, and the walls, scratches, deep ones, dug into the earth, like someone had been trying to claw their way out. I backed up, my chest tight. My flashlight flickered. I turned, ready to leave, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Coming from the tunnel. I ran. I don't remember how I got out. I don't remember reaching the stairs, but I do remember slamming that basement door shut, locking it, and getting the hell out of that cabin. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I didn't breathe easy until I was back on the main road, miles away. I never told my grandma what I found. I don't know who built that tunnel. I don't know who walked down there before me. But I do know one thing, that cabin was never meant to be found again. And I was never supposed to go back. I had been working on the cabin for weeks. It was just a small thing meant to be an escape. A one-room shelter deep in the woods, far from the stress of my life back in town. I had found the land for cheap, about an hour outside of the nearest city. It was dense with trees, far enough from the main road that no one would ever accidentally stumble upon it. That's what I wanted, solitude. The rain had started earlier in the afternoon, and by the time I reached the build site, the dirt road was already turning to mud. The truck's tires slid a little as I parked, but I managed to get it in without too much trouble. I had planned to spend the night out here, working until exhaustion took over and I could sleep on the cot I had set up inside the unfinished structure. I wanted to get the walls fully enclosed before the weather got worse. I stepped out of the truck and pulled my jacket tighter. The cold drizzle seeped into everything. I grabbed my tool bag, a flashlight, and a thermos of coffee before heading to the structure. It was barely a cabin yet, just a frame with half-finished walls and a tarp covering the open roof. I had stacked my supplies against the far wall earlier, and a pile of firewood sat nearby, still mostly dry under a thick plastic sheet. The first thing I did was check for any water pooling inside. The ground was damp, but nothing too bad. I kicked aside some leaves that had blown in and grabbed a hammer. The plan for the night was simple. Finish boarding up the last wall, reinforce the roof tarp, and call it a night. The real roof would come later once I had the time and materials. The rain kept falling, a steady rhythm against the tarp. I worked in silence, just the sound of nails driving into wood and my own breathing. The trees around me swayed with the wind, their branches groaning under the weight of the rain. It was peaceful in a way. I liked the isolation. At least I thought I did. I was nailing in one of the last planks when I heard something. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just an animal moving through the underbrush. Then it happened again, a rustling sound just beyond the trees. I froze, listening. The rain muffled distant noises, making it hard to tell how far away it was. Probably just a deer, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon. I kept working. The sound came again, closer. I set the hammer down and grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the tree line. The beam of light cut through the rain, illuminating the trunks and tangled branches. But there was nothing there, just trees, slick with rain.
Ibaita moment, listening.
The wind whistled through the branches. No movement, no sound. I turned back to my work. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just rustling. It was a distinct sound, footsteps. Slow, careful. I turned fast, the flashlight sweeping across the trees. Again, nothing. My mind started running through possibilities. A lost hiker? A hunter? But no one should be out here. The land was posted, and I had hiked in from the road. There were no other cars parked nearby. I kept the flashlight trained on the trees for another long moment before shaking my head. Probably an animal. Maybe just my imagination. I had been out here alone too much lately. It was easy to start hearing things. I forced myself to get back to work. I was just about done with the wall, hammering in the last few nails when I felt it. Not heard, felt. The sensation of being watched. It was a primal feeling, the kind that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I turned again, slower this time, my breath shallow. The rain had picked up, making it harder to see past the first few rows of trees. I scanned the woods with the flashlight, but everything looked the same. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A shape, a figure standing just beyond the trees. Couldn't make out any details. It was too dark, the rain too heavy, but it was there, motionless, watching. I gripped the hammer tighter, my other hand still holding the flashlight. My first instinct was to call out, but something stopped me. A deep gut feeling told me not to. Instead, I stepped back toward the cabin. Slowly, carefully, I kept my eyes on the figure, but it didn't move. It just stood there. The flashlight flickered. The rain must have seeped in. I tapped it against my palm, but for a moment, the beam wavered. When it steadied again, the figure was gone. I swallowed hard. My heart was pounding now. I scanned the woods again, but there was nothing, just trees. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the rain and shadows had played tricks on my eyes. But I wasn't convinced. I didn't want to stay out there any longer. I grabbed my tools, threw them into the truck, and locked the doors. I debated leaving right then and there, but the road was bad, and I was exhausted. Instead, I climbed into the cab, locked every door, and sat there for a long time, watching the rain streak across the windshield. I don't know how long I sat there, but at some point, exhaustion took over. I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of something tapping against the truck. A soft, deliberate tapping. I sat up fast, gripping the steering wheel. The windows were fogged from my breath, making it hard to see outside. The rain had let up a little, but the tapping continued. I wiped a hand across the glass and looked out. Nothing. I sat there, barely breathing, straining to hear past the sound of the rain. Then, in the side mirror, I saw movement, a figure stepping back into the trees. I didn't hesitate this time. I turned the key, and the truck roared to life. The tires spun in the mud for a second before catching, and I backed out fast, barely glancing at the half-finished cabin as I sped down the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main highway. My hands were still shaking. My mind was racing. I never went back to that cabin. Not once. I left everything there. My tools, my supplies, even my cot. A few months later, I sold the land for a loss. The guy who bought it didn't ask any questions. I didn't offer any answers. But sometimes, when it's late at night and raining, I think about that place. I think about the figure in the trees, and I wonder if it's still watching. I never thought much about isolation until that year. I had always liked being alone. Long walks through the countryside, weekends spent in quiet places away from people, time to think. But there's a difference between choosing solitude and finding yourself completely cut off from everything familiar, realizing that maybe being alone isn't as peaceful as you imagined. It was the summer of 2016 when I took a job in Northumberland, a remote area full of rolling hills, dense forests, and stretches of land that looked like they had been untouched for centuries. The job wasn't anything exciting, just some maintenance work on an old cabin that belonged to a man named Richard, an old acquaintance of my uncle. Richard had bought the place years ago but never had the time to fix it up properly. He had offered to pay me to spend a couple of months repairing it, making it livable again. Seemed like an easy job. The cabin was old but still standing, and I liked the idea of spending summer in the countryside, away from the noise of the city. The cabin itself sat at the edge of a thick forest, a good 20-minute drive from the nearest village. The road leading up to it was rough, barely more than a dirt path, and surrounded by dense trees that swallowed up most of the daylight even in the middle of the afternoon. It wasn't completely abandoned. Richard had used it as a hunting lodge now and then, but it was clear that no one had stayed there for a long time. The wood was weathered, the windows dusty, the door stiff from lack of use. The first week passed uneventfully. I cleaned out the cabin, patched up a few leaks in the roof, and cleared away the overgrown weeds that had taken over the front. It was quiet out there, the kind of quiet you notice when you're used to the constant hum of modern life. No cars, no voices, no distant sounds of machinery. Just the wind through the trees, the occasional rustle of an animal moving in the undergrowth, the creak of the old wooden beams in the cabin when the temperature dropped at night. It was sometime during the second week that I saw her. I had been working outside, fixing one of the steps leading up to the cabin's porch, when I looked up and saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. A woman partially hidden by the shadows of the trees. At first, I thought she might be a hiker, maybe someone from the village who had wandered too far. But there was something off about the way she stood there. She wasn't moving, wasn't adjusting her backpack or looking around like you'd expect from someone lost in the woods. She was just standing there, facing me, barely visible between the trees. I straightened up, wiping the sweat from my forehead, and raised a hand in a casual wave. She didn't react. For a few seconds, I stood there, waiting for some kind of response. A nod, a step forward, something to indicate that she had seen me, but she just stood there. Eventually, I looked away, trying to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. When I glanced back, she was gone. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she had been passing through and didn't want to make conversation. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But that night, as I lay in bed listening to the distant sounds of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see. The next few days I kept working, but I was more aware of my surroundings. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see her standing there again. I never did, but I started noticing little things, subtle, almost insignificant details that I might have overlooked before. The way the birds would suddenly go quiet for no reason. The feeling of being watched when I was working outside. The faint scent of damp earth lingering in the air, even when it hadn't rained. Then, one evening, I found something on the porch. It was a small bundle of twigs, tied together with what looked like thin strips of bark. At first, I thought it was some kind of local craft, maybe something kids from the village had left as a joke. But when I picked it up, I noticed the edges of the twigs were burnt, as if they had been held over a fire. The bark strips were twisted tightly, almost unnaturally so, like whoever had made it had spent a long time perfecting the knots. I tossed it into the fire pit behind the cabin and tried not to think about it. That night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't an animal. I had spent enough time in the countryside to recognize the difference between the slow, deliberate movement of a person and the quick, skittish sounds of wildlife. Someone was out there. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps were slow, circling the cabin. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the faint scrape of something against the wooden walls. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then the footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of the porch boards shifting under someone's weight. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. The door was locked, the windows shut, but I felt exposed. like a trapped animal waiting for the inevitable. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep after that. I waited until the first light of dawn before stepping outside, my hands shaking as I checked the area around the cabin. There were footprints in the dirt. Bare footprints, the kind you'd expect from someone walking without shoes. And then I saw her. She was standing in the tree line again, half hidden behind the dense foliage. Closer this time. I could see her face now, pale, with dark eyes that seemed too large for her thin frame. Her hair hung in tangled strands over her shoulders, her clothes ragged and stained. She was watching me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, staring back at her. Then she smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't belong on a human face. Too wide, too forced, like she was mimicking something she had seen before but didn't quite understand. That was enough. I packed my things that morning, threw everything into my car, and left without looking back. I didn't care about the money, didn't care about finishing the repairs. Whatever was out there, whatever I had seen, I wanted nothing to do with it. I never told Richard the real reason I left. Just said something about family issues and needing to cut the job short. He didn't ask too many questions, and I didn't offer any answers. Years later, I still think about that cabin sometimes. I wonder if anyone else has seen her, if anyone else has felt that same cold dread settle in their bones. And I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I had never thought I would end up alone in a cabin in the woods. But after my divorce, I needed time away from everything. My job, the city, my old life. The divorce had drained me. It wasn't just about losing someone I had once loved. It was the process, the legal battles, the division of everything we had built together. The endless paperwork, the negotiations over things that had once seemed meaningless but now had some weight attached to them. A couch, a set of dishes, the car, even the dog. By the time it was all over, I felt like a hollowed-out version of myself. I didn't want to be around anyone. I didn't want to go to bars, pretend to enjoy conversations, or listen to people tell me that I would find someone else, like that was supposed to fix everything. So I found a cabin. It belonged to an old friend of mine, a guy I hadn't seen in years, but who knew about my situation through mutual friends. He had bought a piece of land in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods, and built himself a small place to get away from the noise of the world. When he heard I needed a break, he offered to let me stay there for as long as I wanted. I didn't hesitate. The cabin was several miles from the nearest town, just a small structure made of dark wood with a pitched roof and a front porch that looked out over an expanse of trees. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service. The only way in or out was a narrow dirt road that was easy to miss if you didn't know where to look. That was exactly what I wanted. First, it felt good to be away from everything. I filled my days with simple things: chopping wood, reading, taking long walks through the forest. The silence was thick, pressing in on me like a weight, but I welcomed it. I told myself this was what healing looked like, being alone, finding peace. But as the days passed, something started to feel off. It was little things at first. I would wake up in the morning and find the door to the cabin slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had locked it the night before. I would go out to grab firewood and get the strange feeling that someone was watching me, even though there was no one around. One night, I was sitting on the porch, staring out into the darkness, when I saw movement between the trees. A quick blur of motion, too fast to make out clearly. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but something about the way it moved made my skin crawl. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was still adjusting to being out here alone. But then there were the footprints. I found them one morning, just outside the cabin. They were human, barefoot, pressed into the dirt. At first, I thought they were mine. But when I compared them to my own, I realized they were larger. Someone else had been standing right outside my door in the middle of the night. That was when I started locking the door and barricading it with furniture. I told myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew I wasn't alone out here. The next night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, listening. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the wind through the trees put me on edge. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, not the soft crunch of an animal moving through the underbrush. These were deliberate, slow, heavy, right outside my window. I held my breath, my body frozen. The steps moved toward the door, then stopped. I waited, heart hammering in my chest. Then a soft tap, tap, tap against the wood. Not knocking, more like someone dragging their fingertips across the surface. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps retreated, fading into the night. I stayed awake until the sun rose, my hands gripping the handle of a knife I had found in the kitchen. By the time morning came, I knew I couldn't stay here. I packed what little I had brought and got into my truck, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I tore down the dirt road, not caring about the bumps and potholes. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached town. I found a motel and locked myself inside, barely able to think. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't want to try to explain something I didn't understand myself. A few days later, my friend called me. "Hey," he said, "you okay?" I told him I was fine, that I had just needed a break. "That's fair," he said. "You left some stuff up at the cabin, though. Want me to grab it for you?" I started to tell him no, that I didn't need any of it. But then he said something that made my stomach drop. "By the way, when were you planning to tell me you had someone else up there with you?" My mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" "I stopped by to check on the place," he said. "Found a bunch of footprints, big ones, and," he paused, "there were food wrappers outside, like someone was hanging around." I didn't say anything, because I knew I had been alone up there. At least I had thought I was. I never went back to the cabin. I never even drove down that road again. Even now, years later, I still think about it. About the door being left open, the feeling of being watched, the footprints in the dirt, and the thought that keeps me awake at night. Whoever was out there had been watching me the whole time, and I had never even seen their face. I never planned to spend the night in that cabin. It was supposed to be a short hunting trip. One weekend in the mountains, just me and the trees. I had been planning it for weeks, going over maps, checking the weather, making sure my gear was in order. The forecast showed cold but clear skies, no rain, no heavy winds. Perfect conditions for tracking deer. I left early Saturday morning. The drive took longer than expected. The dirt roads winding up the hills were worse than I remembered. Potholes deep enough to break an axle, loose gravel that made my tires spin. I had to take it slow, creeping along until I finally reached the clearing where I usually parked. From there, it was a 5-mile hike to my usual hunting spot. I had planned to camp out in my tent, but about 3 miles in, I found the cabin. It was an old single-room structure made of thick logs, tucked just off the trail. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the wood had turned gray from years of rain and snow. There were no windows, just a single door with rusty hinges. It looked abandoned, but not completely ruined. Someone had built it strong. I should have ignored it and kept moving. Instead, I checked inside. The door was stiff, but it opened with a hard push. The inside was exactly what you'd expect. A dirt floor, a small stone fireplace, and a wooden cot pushed up against the far wall. No bedding, just the frame. It smelled like old wood and damp earth. I told myself I wasn't going to stay there. I had my tent. I had my gear. But the idea of sleeping inside with a solid roof over my head was tempting. I decided I'd make camp nearby and use the cabin only if the weather turned. I hiked another half-mile, set up my tent near a clearing, and spent the day tracking deer. I didn't see much, just a few sets of tracks, old and half washed away by last week's rain. The woods were quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you stop walking just to listen, just to make sure you're really alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't. That night, the temperature dropped fast. My breath turned to mist, and the cold seeped through my sleeping bag. I tried to ignore it, curling up tighter, but the wind picked up, pushing through the trees in long, slow gusts. Then came the sound, faint at first, almost like the creak of a branch. Then it happened again. Not a branch, a footstep. I lay there, frozen, my ears straining. The wind made it hard to tell, but I was sure I had heard something. A slow, deliberate step on dry leaves. Another one. It was close. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, the sound stopped. I held my breath, listened. Nothing. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just an animal. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I was out in the open, exposed. The cabin, with its solid walls, suddenly seemed like the safer option. I grabbed my sleeping bag and pack and moved fast, keeping my light off as I made my way back to the cabin. The door was still open the way I left it. I went inside, shut it behind me, and slid my pack against it as a makeshift lock. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and dust. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot and sat there, listening. Nothing. The wind howled outside, but inside, it was silent. I tried to sleep, but every sound kept me on edge. The wind, the creak of branches, the shifting of old wood. Then a sound, closer this time, a soft, dragging noise against the wall outside. I sat up, my pulse pounding. I reached for my hunting knife, gripping it tight. The sound moved, slow, deliberate, like someone running a hand along the logs. Then it stopped. Silence. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then a knock. Not loud. Just a light, testing knock, right against the door. I stopped breathing. Another knock. Soft. Slow. I gripped my knife so tight my hand hurt. My pack was still against the door, but it wouldn't hold if someone really wanted to get in. I waited. The knock came again. I wanted to yell to scare off whoever was out there, but my throat was dry, and some deep, primal instinct told me to stay silent. Then footsteps, slow, steady, moving around the cabin. I tracked them in my mind, listening as they circled. Then they stopped, right outside the back wall. Silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, staring at the door. The footsteps didn't come back. By morning, the light slipped through the cracks in the logs, casting thin lines on the dirt floor. I waited a little longer, listening. The woods were silent again. I opened the door. The ground outside was covered in soft earth and dry leaves. I expected to see tracks. There were none. I packed my gear and left fast, keeping my rifle in my hands. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I never went back to that part of the woods again. It was late autumn when I found myself in a situation I could never have imagined. The leaves had started turning brown, and the air carried a crispness that signaled the approach of winter. I had been on leave from the military for about a week, trying to clear my mind after years of service that had worn me down. It wasn't uncommon for soldiers to struggle with life outside the army, but I didn't expect how quickly my world would be flipped upside down. A friend of mine, a fellow veteran named Ethan, had invited me to his remote cabin deep in the wilderness of Montana. He had bought the place years ago, saying he wanted to get away from everything, and I understood why. He had seen things in war that broke him, things that would make a man want to isolate himself from the world. I hadn't seen him in years, but when he called, there was something in his voice that made me say yes without hesitation. The drive up was long and lonely, the last stretch of the road turning into a dirt path barely wide enough for my truck. Tall pines loomed over me on both sides, casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. There was no cell service, no signs of life apart from the occasional deer darting across the road. When I finally reached the cabin, it was just as I had imagined, small, rugged, and surrounded by nothing but trees. The place looked well kept, but there was something unsettling about it. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the silence that pressed in from all sides. I parked my truck and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. There was no sign of Ethan. I knocked on the door, waited. No answer. I figured he was out hunting or gathering firewood, so I let myself in. The inside was simple. A single-room layout with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a bed against the far wall. A rifle leaned against the doorframe. A hunting knife sat on the table. The place smelled like wood smoke and old leather. I sat down, waiting for Ethan to return. Minutes turned into hours. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness swallowed the forest outside. I stepped out onto the porch, listening. The wind rustled the trees, but there was something else, too. A faint, rhythmic sound coming from the woods. Footsteps. I turned my head, staring into the darkness. Nothing. I wasn't sure why, but my stomach twisted with unease. I had been in combat, faced real threats, but this was different. There was something unnatural about being alone in a place so quiet, so cut off from the rest of the world. An hour later, I heard movement again, closer this time. My pulse quickened as I reached for the rifle by the door. Just as my fingers wrapped around the stock, a shadow moved at the edge of the trees. A figure stepped forward, emerging from the darkness. It was Ethan. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. There was something off about him. He was breathing heavily, his clothes stained with something dark. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time in my life, I felt fear rise in my chest. He walked past me without a word, stepping into the cabin. I followed, my grip tightening on the rifle. Ethan sank into a chair, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them. That's when I noticed his hands were shaking. There was no way to describe the feeling in that moment. Like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing one wrong step would send you plummeting into darkness. I glanced at the hunting knife on the table, then at Ethan. His eyes followed mine. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. Not with words, not with a conversation. He pulled something from his jacket pocket and set it on the table with a soft thud. A military ID, not his. I picked it up, staring at the name. I didn't recognize it. The photo showed a young man, maybe mid-20s, in uniform. There was dried blood on the edges. I looked back at Ethan, my mind racing. He stared at me, waiting for my reaction. I set the ID down carefully, like it might explode. My throat was dry, my heart hammering. I knew what this meant. Ethan had killed someone, a soldier. I forced myself to breathe, my training kicking in. I had seen death, had taken lives in war, but this was different. This was murder. Ethan finally spoke, his voice quiet, strained. They sent him after me. That was all he said before he stood up and walked to the sink, washing his hands like a man trying to scrub away his sins. I sat there, staring at the ID, the pieces falling into place. Ethan had always been paranoid, always believed someone was after him. I thought it was just the war messing with his head. But now I wasn't so sure. I had two choices. I could pretend I saw nothing, walk away, leave this place and never look back. Or I could find out the truth. I chose the latter. Ethan didn't resist when I reached for the rifle again, didn't move as I stood and leveled it at him. His shoulders sagged, as if he had been expecting this. I didn't want to shoot him, so I told him to start talking, and he did. He told me how he had been in contact with someone from our old unit, someone who had warned him that he was being watched, that the military hadn't forgotten what he did. I didn't know what he was talking about. I had served with him, and I never saw him do anything that would warrant a man being hunted down. But as he spoke, I realized there was a whole side to Ethan I never knew. He had been involved in something overseas, something classified. He didn't give details, but whatever it was, it had put a target on his back. The soldier whose ID lay on the table had been sent to kill him. Ethan had killed first. The weight of it all settled on me like a crushing force. I had known Ethan for years. He had saved my life more than once. But now he was just a man with blood on his hands, waiting for the next person to come for him. I made my decision. I set the rifle down. Ethan looked at me, his eyes hollow, and nodded. We buried the body deep in the woods, beneath the roots of an old tree. When I left the cabin the next morning, I knew I would never see Ethan again. The drive back to civilization felt surreal, like waking from a nightmare. But the weight of what I had done, what I had helped cover up, stayed with me. Days later, I saw a news report. A soldier had gone missing. His body was never found, and Ethan's cabin burned to the ground that same week. There was no trace left of him. I never spoke his name again, but sometimes late at night, I wonder if he's still out there, running from the ghosts of his past. And I wonder if one day, someone will come knocking on my door, looking for answers, or worse, looking for revenge. I hadn't driven down that road in years, not since the divorce. Not since we signed the papers and split everything down the middle. The last time I was anywhere near that cabin, I was packing up the last of my things, loading them into my truck while she stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching me with that expression I could never quite read. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was just nothing, like she had already moved on before I even had the chance to. That was 5 years ago. Long enough for me to rebuild my life, start over somewhere else, and put enough distance between myself and that place to pretend it had never existed. But now, for the first time since, I found myself driving that same stretch of road again. I wasn't going there on purpose. I had no reason to, but the main highway was closed, and I had no choice but to take the back roads, the ones that twisted through the thick trees and led me right past the place I swore I'd never return to. The place we used to spend our summers, our weekends, the rare moments when life didn't feel like it was slipping away too fast. The cabin sat about 20 miles off the main road, deep enough into the woods that it never got much traffic. That was the whole point. It was supposed to be an escape, a place where we could be alone, away from the noise, the distractions. Back when things were still good between us, it had felt like home. Now, it was just another stop along a road I didn't want to be on. The sky had been threatening rain all afternoon, and by the time I got close to the turnoff, the first few drops were already splattering against my windshield. The sun had disappeared behind a thick wall of clouds, and the road ahead was darker than it should have been, even for this time of day. I told myself I wouldn't look. I'd keep my eyes straight ahead, drive past without a second thought, and keep going until I was far enough away that the past couldn't reach me. But as soon as I came up on that familiar bend in the road, my hands tightened on the wheel. My stomach twisted into knots, and before I even realized what I was doing, my foot eased off the gas. The cabin was still there. I don't know why I expected it to be gone. Maybe because I had spent so long pretending it didn't exist. Maybe because part of me hoped someone else had taken it, changed it, made it into something new so it wouldn't feel like a ghost of the life I left behind. But it was exactly the same. The same dark wood, the same slanted roof, the same small porch where we used to sit on warm nights with a couple of beers, listening to the wind move through the trees. The windows were dark, empty, no sign of life. I should have kept driving. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. But before I could talk myself out of it, I was pulling off onto the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath my tires. The rain had started coming down harder now, turning the dirt into mud, filling the air with the scent of wet earth and pine. I stepped out of the truck, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The trees swayed overhead, branches creaking with the weight of the wind. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. The memories came back in waves, some good, most not. I remembered the fights, the slammed doors, the nights spent lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering when everything had gone wrong. I remembered the last time I left, walking out that door for the final time, swearing I'd never come back. Yet here I was. I don't know what made me move closer. Maybe it was the way the wind pushed against me, nudging me forward. Maybe it was the way the rain blurred the edges of the cabin, making it look less real, less like something that had once been mine. Or maybe it was the footprints. At first, I thought they were just marks left behind by the rain. But as I got closer, I could see them more clearly. Deep impressions in the mud, leading up to the front porch. Someone had been here, recently. A strange feeling settled in my chest, something between unease and dread. I hadn't expected the place to be abandoned forever. My ex still owned it, after all, but she had never been the type to come out here alone. She hated being by herself. That was one of the reasons we had fallen apart. I hesitated at the bottom of the porch steps, scanning the ground. The footprints were large, bigger than hers, bigger than mine even, and there were a lot of them, like someone had been pacing back and forth. The door was shut, but something about it felt wrong. The doorknob was smeared with mud, and the wood looked scuffed, like it had been kicked or shoved. I should have left right then. I should have turned around, gotten back in my truck, and kept going. But instead, I reached out, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Damp wood, stale air, and something else. Something sharp and metallic, lingering beneath the surface. The inside was just as I remembered. The old furniture, the stone fireplace, the kitchen counter where we used to drink coffee in the mornings before the silence between us became unbearable. Everything was the same, except for the mud. It was everywhere. Dark footprints tracked across the floor, leading from the front door to the back, circling the living room, disappearing down the hall. And the smell was stronger now, coppery, thick. I followed the footprints, my heart pounding harder with every step. The bedroom door was open. The sheets on the bed were pulled back, twisted, like someone had been there recently. The closet door was slightly ajar, just enough to cast a long, thin shadow across the floor. And that's when I saw it. The smear of red on the edge of the mattress. Small but fresh. I took a step back, my pulse hammering against my skull. That was when I heard it. A noise from the other side of the house. Something shifting, moving. I wasn't alone. I turned and ran. I don't remember going back down the hall. I don't remember hitting the porch steps or nearly slipping in the mud. All I remember is the way my hands shook as I yanked open the truck door, the way my breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as I fumbled for the keys. I didn't look back as I peeled out onto the road, tires spitting gravel, rain hammering against the windshield. I don't know who was in that cabin. I don't know what they were doing there, and I don't want to know. I kept driving until I saw the lights of town in the distance, until the road felt less like a nightmare and more like something real. I never went back, and I never will.